Was a soul to be priced at a single coin and yet contain a kingdom of secrets? On a rain-swept morning where the auctioneer's voice rolled like distant thunder, a hunchbacked horse stood as if carved from night, ribs like count lines on an old man's hand, a scar that ran like a struck seam across its flank, and silence heavy as a tombstone round its mouth. Men laughed to see the beast. Women crossed themselves, and a child hid his face. The gavel fell, $1, a coin that buys bread but not a past. Who would flog away such a thing? Who had taught a living heart to be mute? A single thread of blue braided in the horse's mane caught the light and held it, like a secret refusing to be spent. And in that light was the first question that would not stop. What had silenced this creature, and what would it unbolt when its silence was broken? Thomas Hawk kept grief neatly folded like a handkerchief in his breast, and he wore his poverty as a cloak that needed no mending. He rose before the fields, before the gulls swallowed the salt light from the harbor, and he did the small things that make men less lonely: mend a broken cartwheel, feed the widow's hens, whisper to a foal whose mother had died. His hands were large, calloused by rope and dawn, and they trembled only when he held little things. A child's toy, a bent brass bit, a ribbon faded to the color of old blue glass. The ribbon he carried in his pocket as if it might keep him from falling further into the dark he had learned to steward. A grief unnamed, a wound that never scabbed because he never let it air. He kept the ribbon without speaking its name. The town lay in a valley of slate roofs and smoke. Autumn had turned the hedgerows to sorrowful gold. Market day brought men like migrating crows bartering the worth of everything, the worth of a rooster, of a promise, of a horse. Horses in that town lived two lives, once the pride of a field, then the pawn of a ledger. They smelled of hay and the heavy sweet dust of barns. They carried histories in the tautness of their bellies and in the set of their ears. Thomas knew this world by its noises: the iron hoof that spoke of a farrier's skill, the clink of chains that told of a long night in the dark, the auctioneer's roll that turned memory into coin. He walked it like a man who had learned to read small tragedies in the bend of a neck. He had his routine: a cup of thin coffee, a walk by the miller's pond, a slow hand on the neck of any horse that would permit it. He did not seek triumph. He sought mercy, for animals, for himself. In the hush beside the barley stacks, he would press his forehead to warm hide and think of a voice that was no longer there. He did not tell the town of the voice that had gone. To tell would make the wound louder. He worked for a master he served with quiet exactness because work steadied him. Yet nights he kept the ribbon, and in the ribbon he heard a laugh that belonged to a life with one less absence. That laugh was never said aloud. Rumor circled like a carrion crow. Once there had been a stable across the bridge, owned by a man called Blackthorn, whose temper was as sharp as the brand he carried to mark stock. People nodded, swallowed, then spoke in softer tones, for Blackthorn's stable had been a place where horses were broken and some were broken beyond mending. They said he branded not for identification but to remind the beast of its surrender. The brand, men whispered, was a crescent pierced by a bar, a mark you could not scrub from hide. It hung in Thomas's mind like a fact he might one day need to know but hoped never to see. He kept that story with the ribbon, and when he passed the empty gate of Blackthorn's place he felt a cold as if a hand had been laid upon his heart. When the auction notice came, Thomas almost did not go. He had little coin and less appetite for townspeople's jeers, but the market had its pull. Sometimes pity walked in front of a man as his own shadow and would not be ignored. The day was small rain and sleet. The auction ground smelled of wet tar and old straw. Men jostled. Children watched. In a pen, as if placed there to be forgotten, stood the rejected horse. It did not flinch at the passage of men nor try to plead. It bore a scar, a pale slash along its flank that glittered with an old stitch of hair. It stood with its head low like one who has held a secret too long and grown tired of breathing it into the world. Thomas saw more than the town did: a softness in the horse's eye when the wind caught the dust, a tremor of the lip that suggested memory rather than dullness. He thought, without knowing why, that the beast had a name in its hurt. He felt that the coin it would fetch would not measure the measure of its truth. He kept his thumb against the ribbon in his pocket and listened to the auctioneer speak of loss, of salvage, of use. When the lot came, a single man lifted a hand, laughed at the price, and the gavel fell. $1. The price of pity. The murmurs rose, some angry, some amused. A child cried out at the injustice. Thomas did not bargain. He lifted his hand, put up his coin, and the auctioneer's gavel brought the horse to him like a sentence. He led the animal home along a road that remembered many footsteps. The horse walked as if water were heavier in its legs than light. People watched him pass, some with scorn, some with a softened gaze that said, "There goes a man who takes what others cast." Thomas murmured a name he had not spoken for years just to hear a mouth shape it. Lark. It was not the horse's true name, and neither was it his. But names have a way of finding what they are meant for, and in the horse's silence something answered like a bell faintly stirred. The horse kept its silence like a vow. It would not take bread with the avarice of hunger. It refused oats with eyes that said trust had been betrayed too often to be bartered anew. When Thomas reached to collar it with a halter, the beast flinched and jerked. The muscles in its haunches knotted like a bowstring about to snap. Its ears flattened when he came close, not with malice but with the memory of hands that had once punished rather than soothed. He moved slow because slow is sometimes the only language of the repentant. He spoke no long speeches. He offered the ribbon only to find it dulled in his pocket, as if the world had sucked all bright things thin. He washed its flank and found the scar's story mapped in the hide, a pale concavity where flesh had once been torn, now knit by nature's coarse needle. There were other marks too, a healed rope burn round a forearm, the faint outline of a cut on its chest. These things are textbooks of unkindness in the life of an animal. Thomas held his hand there, fingers warm, and the horse trembled but did not pull away. It let the touch be like a small trial and withheld everything else. That withholding was a greater wound than any that bled outward. Gideon Price watched. Gideon was a man with money and thin mercy. He measured worth by how quickly a thing could be turned to profit. He came with the easy swagger of one who expects his will to be the reply to any question. "Throw your coin away, Hawk," he said aloud one market morning, loud enough that others would hear. "That beast will take thy time and give thee nothing." The words burned like straw. Thomas said nothing that would feed Gideon's appetite. He had learned that not all wounds required answer. Yet Gideon lingered at the fence as if the horse were not a subject to be left alone but a chess piece to be maneuvered. Days stretched, and the horse taught Thomas the cost of patience. At night it stood like a sentinel of memory, ears vigilant even in sleep. When thunder came, and in that town thunder came as if the sky itself repented, the beast would not flee. It held, trembling as men sometimes hold when the ground shifts beneath them. Thomas soothed with the half-words of a man with little practice in praise. "Steady, steady." The words were small lamps. One night the horse stamped in the yard and a cluster of neighbors whispered of restlessness. They spoke of sale, of trade, of Gideon's grin. Thomas worried the rim of his coffee cup and dreamed of a hand that would not be taken from him again. A rain-swollen evening brought more than water. A messenger came who said there was a summons from the magistrate, a complaint that the horse had been taken from a man who claimed rightful title. Thomas's coin was thin. His rightness was not a document the magistrate could weigh. He went because to cower invites law to bite harder. In the magistrate's room, a paper was produced that bore a name he did not know, Jasper Reed, of Blackthorn Lane. The paper said the horse had been sold without due notice, that the sum had been meager, and that reclaiming was the legal course. The magistrate's face congealed into neutral salt. Law requires form. For a moment it seemed the beast might be taken from him. Gideon smiled like frost and offered to broker a solution. He said he would buy the horse from the claimant and turn it to profit, and he did not hide the pleasure that sat in his voice. Thomas listened. A little town is small in its choices. To fight would be to spend coin and blood both. To lose would mean returning to his small life with a pocket emptied of mercy. He left the magistrate and walked back over the bridge, the Blackthorn place a dark notch against the sky. In the mud he saw a tiny scrap of ribbon snagged in the hedgerow, blue like the one in his pocket, caught as if a child's toy had been left there. He pocketed it without thinking, because habit will sometimes do for courage what will does not. That very night a storm came that felt as though the world had chosen to rebuke itself. Lightning lanced the river and the horse startled as if some old name had been called in the thunder. It bolted from the yard and the halter snapped like a promise. Thomas ran after it through the black rain, his boots pulling from mud, breath bent with fray. The horse plunged through hedges over a stile into the lane where the willow dips and remembers all it has seen. Thomas called, voice thin as a reed, but the horse ran to something or from something. in a headlong haste that did not match fear alone. The neighbors rose in windows, silhouettes with towels and shouts. Gideon watched from his doorway and did not move to help. They lost the horse near the old Blackthorn stable, where the gate hung like a jaw half closed. There, in the puddled light, Thomas caught up and found the animal pressed against the splintered fence, sides heaving. Its eyes were wide, and there was mud on the scar that made the pale line stand out like a brand in a map. Thomas reached for it. The horse flinched, then did something no one had seen. It lifted a foreleg and scraped at the earth, revealing a piece of something wrapped in oilskin, a fragment of leather, a tag, a name half effaced. Thomas's fingers closed over it as the storm breathed cold down his neck. The tag bore a mark, a crescent pierced by a bar, a description he'd heard in whispers, the whispered sign of Blackthorn's cruel hand. The discovery struck him like a small thunder. How many stories could that brand tell? How many nights had it recorded in scar tissue the light of hands that had not known mercy? Thomas looked for the first time into the horse's face and saw not a blankness but a ledger that held accounts due. He remembered the ribbon in his pocket and felt it like a pulse. The horse's nostrils flared. It leaned ever so slightly into him, as if seeking the warmth of a hand that would not punish. In that lean there was a note of recognition neither could yet name, but recognition is a fragile thing. Gideon had seen the movement from his doorway. He crossed the yard in long strides and said, as if reciting weather, "That tag might be worth more than thy coin, Hawk. Someone will pay for beasts with papers like that." His smile was a map of appetite. A voice called from the lane. Men were coming, lanterns bobbing like predatory insects. Rumor travels faster than truth in small towns, and whatever tremor began that night gathered itself into a hunt. Thomas felt the weight of eyes, and he feared that what was private, a horse pressed to his chest, a brand that might prove old cruelties, would be turned into public consequence. He wrapped the oilskin in his coat and led the horse home through the rain, every footfall a little clatter of fear. At the yard the animal would not eat, but it did not bolt again. Instead it stood and, as if conceding something, let its head fall to the fence and the blue ribbon Thomas put there, the ribbon he had kept, because it was a wordless prayer. He tied the ribbon into the horse's mane with hands that shook, and the animal closed its eyes like a man who had received news he had waited for but had not dared hope to hear. A hush followed, a small peace like an inhale. It lasted only as long as a breath. For every mercy a town offers, there is a hand ready to reclaim it. In the yard, a noise, and the creak of a cart, the whisper of boots, and then a voice that Thomas had not wanted to hear. "That is the beast from Blackthorn," said the newcomer, and his tone was not one of gentleness. He claimed to have known the horse years ago, in a way that smelled of claim and of trade. He named a stable, an owner, a debt unpaid. His words were smooth, but they carried teeth. Thomas felt something shift at the base of his skull, a decision forming like ice on a winter pond. He would either stand an answer or lose what he had tried to mend. His thumb touched the ribbon in his pocket, feeling the tiny braid like a bell. The horse, which had stood so long in silence, breathed in, and the breath made a sound low and almost human. It was not a whinny nor a neigh, but a single soft vocalization, a note that matched in cadence and sorrow the laugh whose echo had lived in Thomas's pocket for years. The sound sliced the night with an odd intimacy. The newcomer froze as if struck. Gideon smiled thinly, and others moved closer. The yard felt suddenly like a stage, and then, with that single soft sound, the horse did the one thing no soul expected. It lifted its head and rubbed its nose against Thomas's palm, and where its lip brushed skin there fell from its mane a scrap of blue cloth. A ribbon not merely similar but indistinguishably the same faded thread as the one in his pocket, braided in a child's fashion. For a breath the world narrowed to the color of that blue. Thomas's hand closed, the scrap cold and real, and the town held its breath as if awaiting sentence. Who had braided that ribbon? Whose child had left it there? How had such a thing come to be both in his pocket and in the mourner's mane of a cast-off horse? The question burned like lamp oil. Behind it surged another, larger and darker, the brand on the horse's flank, that crescent pierced by a bar, the mark of Blackthorn. If that brand was true, then the horse carried proof of a cruelty that had been whispered for years. If the ribbon was true, then a link had been made between Thomas's small private grief and whatever the horse had bore across its skin. Men at the fence leaned forward. Gideon predicted profit. The newcomer predicted right. The air tasted of coming storm. At the edge of the yard, a shadow detached itself from the night and moved with the quiet step of one who has kept a secret too long. It stopped beneath the lantern and threw back a hat to reveal a face that, if it had once been known to Thomas, might unravel everything he had kept folded. The person spoke, and their voice, intimate and terrible, named a place and a date that Thomas had tried to forget. The horse snorted, nostrils flaring, and the blue scrap in Thomas's palm stung like an accusation. The revelation hung there, as if the town itself leaned in to hear whether mercy or judgment would be given. The yard holds breath. A face from the past appears, a branded horse, a braided ribbon, and a claim that promises to upend Thomas's fragile mercy. The question now, who stands under the lantern and what truth will that face demand? The figure beneath the lantern took off his hat as if unmasking sunlight, and the face that showed was older than the years on Thomas's memory, but known as a wound, known by its shape. It was Blackthorn, or the man who carried his name like a shadow, and his mouth was a thin line that had learned to profit from silence. He had come with a gait that smelled of ledgers and late bargains. His eyes were small, hard coins. He spoke the town's name as one might speak a debtor's oath, and in that voice Thomas heard the old ledger of his life. Accounts unpaid, things given for need and never returned. Blackthorn said, as if rehearsing a weather report, "I hear of debts and of rags taken as charity. This beast has claimants. Show me thy receipt, hawk, if thou wouldst keep what wilt not feed thee." There was a ring of men, lantern light turning their faces to warn pewter. Gideon stood like a serried tooth beside Blackthorn, his pleasure visible as a hawk's. The newcomer, the man who had first named the horse, stepped forward too, and his hand rested on a paper that smelled of profit and of old ink. Thomas felt the chamber of his ribs tighten. The ribbon in his pocket seemed suddenly weightier than coin. He had brought pity and a single dollar. The town came with law and with appetite. The horse shifted its weight and snorted, a breath of damp straw and remembered kindness. It stamped and pawed the earth, and as if remembering a lesson of flesh, it leaned into Thomas. "Brought to me is the tag," Blackthorn said, "and the claim, and the right of title. Show me the chain of purchase or yield it back." He spoke and expected assent like a tax. Instead, Thomas did a simple thing. He reached into his pocket and showed the blue braid. It lay like a token of prayer between his thumb and the world. The lantern light caught it and seemed to make the thin threads sing. Blackthorn's face tightened. He had been seen before in the town's good rooms, a man who made trade of animals and men, and to be seen is often to be judged. "Where didst thou get that?" he demanded. The question sounded like a challenge thrown down between men. Thomas did not answer with fury. He answered with what he possessed, time and attention. "It was in the horse's mane," he said, voice low as damp moss, "and also in my pocket." "Is that not strange, sir, that two threads should wear the same memory?" A laugh went about the yards like a loose dog. "Threads," Gideon said, "are for fools. Men with wits buy beasts and sell beast. You would make poetry from tatters and call it law." But the horse would not be dismissed as tatters. It drew itself small, and then, with the solemn stubbornness of the hurt, it nosed at the loose board by the stable wall, that same wall where children had once leaned to whisper, and where old Blackthorn had kept secrets under nail and dust. Horses know places by their smell and by the memory of hands. Some carry the names of the houses they have kept. The animal nosed again, then pawed, the hoof beating a rhythm that seemed to say, "Here." The horse's actions were neither show nor trick. They were a memory seeking daylight. Blackthorn cursed, a short, sharp thing, and moved to stop it. Men laughed and shoved and sought to profit by the scramble. Thomas stepped forward, not to wrestle, but to protect the gesture of a creature that had given him its small, hesitant trust. He placed his hand on its neck, and the horse leaned into his palm as if into an old, half-remembered song. Then, with a noise like old hinges surrendering, the loose board gave. Beneath it, wrapped in oilskin and bound by a leather cord stiff with age, Thomas found a bundle. He unrolled it with the clumsy, trembling hands of one who knows how to unlace grief, and from it spilled papers, receipts and names, and most terrible, a child's scrap of writing. The handwriting was small and hurried, and the name at the top was one Thomas had not dared say aloud in years. Lark. For a breath, the town forgot to speak. The papers were a map of a cruelty made ordinary by business. Entries that read like price lists for animals. Notes that kept the names of men who had come to Blackthorn's stable for things they did not admit in daylight. And there, in an account book scrawled with dates and small cruel economies, was a line that made Thomas's stomach like flint. 18th August, Lark. Accident, handled, paid off. The ledger's ink placed loss into columns as if sorrow were an item to be balanced. Blackthorn's back went cold. For a man who kept darkness as he kept his tills, to be found out is worse than any wound. He laughed in a way that was not mirth. Accident, he said, and his voice carried the same dryness as an unpaid debt. What do you seek? A confession? Men make mistakes. We make amends. Thou made a ledger for life and death, Thomas said, each word a small hammer. Thou put my child's name upon thy list and called it accident. Tell us now, how is my Lark taken from the world? Who paid? Who bought the silence? His voice rose not with accusation, but with the nakedness of a man stripped of his old cough of control. The town listened and bristled, for a grief is a contagious thing. The air between debts and mercy thinned. Blackthorn's face filled with a new color, fear chiseled into shame. He turned to Gideon, then to the other men who had profited by the stable's work. It was an accident, he said again, voice thick now. A child fell. I hid what I could to save the business. I sold the horse to cover the rest. We paid a man to speak low, to take coin for silence. What else would a man do when his trade is threatened? His words were small, excuses that tried to build nets out of air. Silence swallowed him. The simple cruelty of ledger speak had been exposed as what it was, a paper-smoothed act of want. The town's judgment did not need to be loud. It lived then in the faces turned away, in the soft step of women who had once given alms. Gideon cursed softly and tried to gather his usual mercantile language, but in the space the horse stepped forward. It did what a human could not exactly ask of it. It laid its head upon the pile of papers, and then with a motion of muzzle and tooth, it pulled from the bundle a small oilskin-wrapped thing whose shape Thomas recognized before he unrolled it. A child's wooden whistle, carved with initials that matched the name Lark. Thomas's hands closed upon the whistle as if closing upon an ember. It was salt-warm with the damp of the night. The instrument of a child's play. How cruel that such a thing could arrive here as evidence. Thomas lifted it to his lips. For an instant, impossibly achingly, the whistle sang the note his child used to sing at dusk. The same note that lulled roosters and that once mended Thomas's nights. The sound was small, yet it cleaved the yard like a bell. Blackthorn's knees went soft. It was an accident, he repeated, voice now thin with the weight of confession. The child slipped near the stable door. There was blood and fright. We were afraid of scandal, of creditors. We thought if the matter were hushed, we might save others. We did not mean to make a kingdom of lies. I buried the truth where no one would look and sold what could be sold to buy quiet. Forgive me if one can ask forgiveness. Forgiveness is not something a man can mint with words like coins. Thomas stood, the whistle in his fingers, and felt every year that had been stolen from him like a stack of unpaid days. He wanted rage. He wanted the old man to be broken on a wheel of law. He wanted the town to take what was owed and not be spared by pity. But the horse and that mispriced cast-off creature bent its head and placed the blue ribbon across Thomas's palm, as if to say, the child's play is here. The animal's gesture was small and clear, asking only that he see what lay plain. Thomas knelt then, in the mud and under the rain and with the town bearing witness, and he held the whistle as a man holding a relic. In his mind, the years tumbled, the lost lullaby, the stew that had gone cold, the nights spent with hands useless and prayers that did not reach their end. Blackthorn's confession did not return the child to him, but it offered a truth, and truth is sometimes the only solid thing left when everything else has been sold. There followed a clamor of voices. Some called for law, others for lantern-lighted retribution. Gideon wanted to file claims. The newcomer wanted to prove title and be paid. Thomas listened and then did another act that surprised himself. He spoke not for vengeance but for the horse. What is fit for those who have been wronged? He asked, and in that question there was no disguise. Shall we make a show of punishment and call it justice, or shall we name what was done and bind it, so others may see the price of a life? The town answered with a dozen small opinions. The magistrate's badge came forward, and with it a promise of inquiry. Blackthorn was led to account. Gideon was watched for complicity, and the newcomer, the would-be claimant, was given papers to verify his right. The horse that had borne cruelty and silence stood quiet as a church pillar. Its eyes were soft as if the light had at last found rhythm with an old song. Thomas rose, his face a map of grief, and the whistle in his hand felt like the weight of both loss and of the first step toward mending. Yet none of these things removed the ache. The ledger named the manor of Lark's End, but it did not return laughter. The horse, in its own mute wisdom, laid a warm nose against Thomas's cheek and let out a sound that was almost a laugh, a curving, small sound that held recognition and the odd blessing of a creature whose memories had been kept against great odds. The act sealed the moment. It made what had been hidden visible, and in that visibility there was, for the first time in years, a sense that the world might be rearranged to hold what had been lost. As inquiries begin and the town murmurs its verdict, a deputation returns with news that will either redeem Blackthorn or condemn him further, and it bears a witness whose name is writ in the ledger, but whose fate was assumed years ago. Will the witness be found living to tell the rest, or shall the ledger stand as the only voice? The horse, braided ribbon, and whistle have opened a door. Who will cross it next? In the gray hours before dawn, men came with the slow bureaucratic cadence of those who carry papers and believe the world is mended by stamp and seal. They searched stable and loft, the loft where hay had muffled cries and where the town's secrets sometimes lay like dry tinder. They found more, receipts for hush money, a name scrawled with an uneven hand that matched other entries in the ledger, a record of payments to a man who had once been seen near the river, on nights when moonlight was thin. The magistrate, a careful man whose eyes were netted with small compassion, ordered that Blackthorn be held for inquiry while the search for corroboration continued. Blackthorn's face lost its practiced hardness and showed a man who had learned, late and bitterly, the price of living by other men's misfortunes. He confessed more: names, nights, the count of the payments he had made to silence those who might have spoken. He gave up the stable keys and the business's books as if surrendering a garment that no longer fit. Gideon, whose business had been nimble in the market of misfortune, found himself brushed by a social cooling. Customers who had been willing to stand in the market now kept distance from a man whose hand had been near the ledger of a child's life. The newcomer who had claimed the horse argued his case, but with Blackthorn's confession the claim grew thin as the paper it was written on. Meanwhile, Thomas did the work a man must when truth has torn a place in his chest. He set his affairs in order and faced the small stack of days he had left to be practical with. He tended the horse as if tending a candle's flame in a draught. The animal allowed more now. It would take a carrot from his hand and chew slowly, ears flicking like small alert waves. It followed at his shoulder in the yard and, when the evening came, rested its head upon his knee as if reading the map of his sorrow and finding in the lines a chart for shared company. The town spoke of the whistle and the ledger as it speaks of omens. In kitchens and on thresholds, women kept the account of what had been revealed. Some cried, some shook their heads. People who had looked away now found themselves leaning forward, and the small civic machinery of law creaked into motion. Blackthorn's hearing was set. Witnesses were coaxed to speak, and the magistrate asked questions that would be put to oath. Lark's name, once a private ghost in Thomas's chest, now lived in public breath, and with that living, the world applied itself differently to his days. Thomas feared the court not for the law but for the theater. He had no desire for his child's absence to be a spectacle, yet he walked into the hearing with the whistle in his pocket and the blue braid tied to his coat like an emblem. He sat and watched as men testified. The farrier with his memory of a late-night cough, the boy who had once seen a carriage near the stable, the woman who had sold Blackthorn feed and heard the sharp word that managed to hush even a cough. These bits knit into a pattern that made the ledger a living thing, each piece of proof that Blackthorn had not been cruel by chance but by choice. When the magistrate asked Blackthorn how he could sleep at night after what he had done, the old man answered in a voice not unlike bark in a storm, "We were afraid of ruin." The magistrate's reply was a courtly thing, tempered by law, but the town would not be mollified by the excuse of fear. Justice, when it moves in small towns, has a shape of both mercy and example. Blackthorn was bound to answer for the concealment, and for the trade that had commodified life. He was not, however, to be judged by the only measure the heart asks. He could not restore the years Thomas had lost, nor the lullabies unsung. Outside the court, the horse stood patient as a statue, ears pricked at the passing of figures and the rustle of judgment. Children came to see the creature that had changed a town's conscience, and they reached in small, brave hands to stroke the mane. Thomas watched these children with a complicated softness. He thought of what had been and of what might be in time. He could not bring back the exact sound of Lark's laugh, but the whistle in his pocket and the horse at his side were small talismans that might, in the slow mending of days, knit new music into his life. In the weeks that followed, the magistrate's inquiry produced an outcome that was neither wholly ruinous nor comfortably neat. Blackthorn was fined and stripped of the license to trade in animals for negligence and concealment. The town's council set up new rules for stable oversight so that no ledger could again be allowed to hush a life into silence. Gideon paid a price of reputation. Men who had once dealt with him thought twice before trusting him with creatures that bore names rather than numbers. The newcomer who had claimed the horse receded, his papers rendered moot by the revelation that this beast was not mere property, but witness. The town did not cheer. It only gathered itself with a sober recognition that wrongs had been done, and that confession alone does not unclench absence. Thomas, for his part, did not stand upon a pedestal. He returned to his quiet duties, mending a cart for a widow, feeding hens, the slow, honest work that stitches the days together. The horse, which he now called Lark without hesitation, for the name had always been meant, stayed with him. It learned to trust hands again. It dropped its flinch and grew a tentative pleasure in being led by a man whose sorrow matched his own. They walked fields together where the wind cut the grass to songs, and sometimes at dusk, the whistle would find his lips and call out a note that echoed across hedgerows. Children paused in their play to listen, and some would answer the tiny call with a laugh that bore the color of sun. There was still pain. Grief does not dissolve at the sound of confession, but the town, chastened, had at least made a small repair. A plaque was put near the stable gate. Not a monument of praise, but a sober, brief reminder in plain letters that life is not to be balanced like a ledger. The horse lived on in the town's memory as a creature who had been sold for a single coin, and by that act had reshaped what it meant to keep faith. Time is a patient tailor, and Thomas let it take measure. Months stitched themselves into seams. The horse's coat grew thicker, the scar still showed but less raw, and the ribbon in his pocket faded to the same soft blue as the sky before rain. Thomas learned to sleep without waking at every small sound, though some nights the whistle would slip from his hand and wake the house with the ghost of a lullaby. Children came to his yard and asked about the tale, and he would tell them not as a tale but as a truth, that some men wear bargains like chains, that silence often has a price, and that to notice is sometimes to save. On a morning with the light thin as new vellum, Thomas walked the horse to the hill by the river. The town lay below like a map of small sins and smaller mercies. He released the halter, and the animal stood as if offered a kingdom. It nosed the grass, then turned and came back to him, placing its forehead against his chest in the way of creatures that both ask and give blessing. He felt in that contact the closing of a long season. The whistle in his pocket was warm. He took it out and let it sit between his palms. He thought of all early things, of the ribbon braided by a child's fingers, of ledger lines that had once tried to name life, of Blackthorn's confession, which had not healed the wound but had washed some of the rot from the bone. He thought of the town's little corrections, the magistrate's order, the plaque near the stable. These were small stitches hardly worthy of poetry, and yet they mattered. The horse shifted its weight and, with a motion as plain as a bell, dropped its head and allowed Thomas to put the blue ribbon in its mane. The gesture completed an arc that had begun in silence and been mended by small, relentless acts of attention. Thomas spoke one name, Lark, but not as a plea nor as a prayer. He spoke it as a man who had learned to carry absence without being consumed by it. Live, he said to the animal, and the single word hung high and clear. The horse breathed, and in that breath there was an answer that did not need language. It turned, walked a few paces, and then came back to Thomas's side. It stood quiet and patient as a covenant. That evening, as the sun sank like a coin into the river, Thomas set the whistle upon the mantelpiece and tied the spare blue braid there beside the ribbon. He did not place them as trophies but as tokens, items that would remind him both of what he had lost and of what he had saved. He would not pretend the child's laughter returned. He would not forge a substitution for what had been taken, but he would allow space for life to be made, not identical to the past, but a life that could be spoken of without the acrid aftertaste of silence. In the years that followed, children learned the whistle's little tune and sang it at markets. Parents gave their animals names with a new care, and the town, which had once been content to price and pass on lives, found itself kinder in small ways. Thomas died not because grief crushed him, but because age came with its ordinary claims. In his hands, the whistle had become a relic of a life owned as much by sorrow as by love. On his coffin lay a blue ribbon, and beside it a horseshoe, not a claim, but a symbol that the beast that had been sold for $1 had been worth more than coin. The horse lived on, tended by hands that had once been strangers and had learned to be gentle. It bore the ribbon in its mane, and, when it grazed on the hill of the town, children would whisper its name. It became not a monument but a living testament, that attention can be a kind of justice, that confession can make room for repair, and that a single act of compassion, even when measured as small as $1, can bend the arc of many days. On the last evening, when Thomas's voice could no longer be heard, but his presence still warmed the hearth, the horse came and stood before the house and placed its head upon the threshold as if to guard the doorway one more time. It lifted its eye to the sky, and the world held its breath as the last light painted the hills. In that glance there was the hush of an old music and the quiet approval of a creature that had once been silenced and had found, at last, a voice in the stead of a man who had loved in spite of the price. Then, with the patient grace of things that endure, the horse turned and walked down the lane, ribbon in mane, hooves soft on the earth that had once sold it cheap. It moved like a small prayer, a living line that connected what had been taken to what had been given back. In its passage was the final consolation. Wounds can be named, and once named, they stop pulling the world crooked. And so the town learned, slowly, imperfectly, to keep accounts differently. They would not forget the ledger, nor the whistle, nor the way a single blue braid had bridged a gulf. They remembered that mercy is work, that memory requires tending, and that the smallest of creatures may hold the largest of truths. One evening, in the hush that follows sorrow turned to story, Thomas's last breath seemed to cross with a horse's soft exhalation. The two things, man and beast, had kept each other company long enough to make the world kinder for a time. And in the quiet, a voice might have said this, and if none but the heart heard it, that was enough. We paid in coin, but earned instead the price of a life. If this tale of loss and small mercy moved thee, subscribe and press the bell that thou mayest return anon for songs of sorrow and of solace. Leave a word below what line struck thy heart, and share this story that we may keep such reckonings from the silence. If thy soul was stirred, subscribe and ring yon bell, that thou mayest join us anon for tales untold.